My name is Walter Greer. I am 57 years old, and 3 weeks ago, at a black-tie gala in downtown Atlanta, my daughter-in-law began applauding the keynote speaker before she saw who it was. When she saw the face on the screen, her hand stopped. When she turned to tell me something, the seat beside her was empty. I was already at the podium. This is that story. I want to tell it from the beginning, because the beginning is the whole point, and the ending only lands if you understand what the 3 years before it actually felt like from where I was standing. Let me tell you who I am. Not the version she told people at dinner parties and work lunches and company events when someone asked who the older man sitting quietly at the table was. The actual version. I spent 32 years in industrial infrastructure consulting, water treatment systems, municipal bridges, utility corridor planning, large-scale civil projects that do not make you famous and do not come with a publicist, but make the parts of cities function that people only notice when they stop working. I started as a field surveyor at 23, working construction sites in Georgia and Alabama in the kind of heat that reminds you your body is a tool you are choosing to use as hard as possible. I moved through project management, then regional oversight, then into the consulting side of the industry when I was in my mid-40s, and the larger firms started paying for what lived inside my head rather than what I could do with my hands. By the time I retired at 55, I had consulted on infrastructure projects in 14 states. I had given formal testimony before 3 state legislative committees on matters of municipal water system modernization and bridge safety assessment. I had built an independent consulting firm over 11 years, starting with 2 employees and a rented office above an insurance agency in Marietta, and I had sold that firm 18 months before any of this story takes place to a larger regional engineering group for a number I am not going to say out loud, because I was raised in a household where you did not discuss money directly, and some habits are older than good sense. I did not retire because I was finished. I retired because I had enough, because my body was beginning to register objections to 30 years of field work, and because my wife had asked me for a long time to slow down, and I had spent a long time finding reasons not to. Her name was Margaret. She passed away 2 years before I sold the firm. Ovarian cancer. We had 8 months from the diagnosis to the end, and I was with her every hour of those 8 months that I was physically capable of being present, and if I had to do it again, I would do it the same way, except I would have started earlier, I would have slowed down earlier, I would have given her more of the years that I gave to job sites and proposal meetings and flights to Sacramento and Raleigh and Columbus. That is the one thing I cannot think about cleanly. Everything else in my life I can examine without flinching. That I carry differently. After Margaret died, it was just me and my son. My son's name is Daniel. He is 34 years old. He is a genuinely good man, and I want to say that with all the precision I can manage, because what I am about to tell you involves him, and I do not want anyone reading his character incorrectly from the shape of the story. Daniel is decent and hard-working and present. He calls me every Sunday without being asked. He drove to my house the day I closed the sale of the firm unannounced with a bottle of 15-year bourbon and 2 glasses. And we sat on my back porch, and he said, "Dad, you did it." And that was the complete sentence, and it was everything. He is a good father to my grandson, a 4-year-old named Charlie, who is the most comprehensively joyful human being I have encountered in 57 years of living, and who has recently decided that the correct volume for all communication is somewhere between loud and aircraft. Daniel met his wife at 30. Her name is Renata. She is 37 years old, and she is the vice president of corporate partnerships at a mid-sized technology events company in Atlanta called Vantage Group. Her job is the architecture of relationships at scale, sponsorships, executive access programs, the orchestration of large corporate gatherings where the right people are placed in the same room and the right conversations are allowed to happen. She is exceptional at it. I mean that without irony or qualification. She has a memory for names, titles, and organizational hierarchies that is almost unsettling in its precision. And she moves through a professional room with the specific fluency of someone who has spent years understanding that attention is a currency, and she knows exactly how to spend it. She decided, sometime in the first year of knowing me, that I was not worth her attention. I want to be careful about how I describe this because it is easy to make it sound more dramatic than it was, and the truth is more interesting than the drama. She was never openly rude to me, not once. She was cordial. She remembered that I took my coffee black and that I did not eat pork. She asked me how I was doing at the beginning of dinners and at the end of family events. She included me in Christmas plans and birthday gatherings. On the surface, she was a perfectly functioning daughter-in-law. What she did was quieter than rudeness and, in the way of quiet things, harder to address. She introduced me to people as Daniel's father, not as Walter Greer, not with any context about who I was or what I had done. Just Daniel's father, in the brisk and courteous tone of someone moving through a social checklist. When someone at a dinner party or a family gathering asked what I did, she answered for me. "He's retired," she would say, always in the same register. The word in her mouth had a specific texture. It did not mean accomplished. It did not mean a man who had built something over 3 decades. It meant finished. It meant he was someone once in a smaller world, and now he is here. I learned about the specific phrase from a woman named Gail Trenton. Gail worked in the client services division at Vantage Group and had been at the company for about 7 years. I had met her twice at family events and found her direct and warm in the way of people who are direct and warm because they are simply built that way, rather than because the situation calls for it. About 14 months after Daniel and Renata were married, Gail and I found ourselves at the same table at a wedding reception for one of Daniel's college friends. We ended up talking for almost an hour. She was smart and funny and asked me real questions and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. Near the end of the evening, she said, "I have to be honest with you, Mr. Greer. I had a very different picture of you from what Renata had described. I asked her what Renata had described. She was uncomfortable. But she told me, 'Retired nobody.' That was the phrase, used not once but repeatedly, in professional contexts, where it apparently served as an explanation for why she didn't involve her father-in-law in certain things or bring him to certain events. Sweet enough. But honestly, Gail, he is just a retired nobody. There is nothing there. He fixed water pipes somewhere for a long time, and now he sits in his house and watches television. I sat with that for a long time. I want to tell you exactly what I did after Gail told me, because the answer is specific and it is important. I drove home. I made a cup of coffee. I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about it the way I think about every significant problem, which is by taking it apart methodically and examining each component without rushing toward a conclusion. First, I asked myself whether she was right. That is always the first question, not because I enjoy self-criticism, but because it is the honest one. Was she right? She was not right, but I understood how she had arrived at her conclusion. I had not explained myself to her. I had not told her what I had built or what it had cost, or what anyone in the infrastructure industry would have said if you asked them whether Walter Greer was someone whose calls they returned. I had sat at her dinner table and eaten her food and talked about Charlie and the weather and a book I had read about the construction of the Hoover Dam, and I had never once told her what my professional life had actually looked like. I do not think a man should have to produce his credentials to be treated with basic human dignity. But I also understand that the world operates on information, and I had given her none. Second, I asked myself what I was going to do about it. The obvious answer was to say something, to tell Daniel, to have a conversation with Renata directly, to make it an incident in the way that small disrespects become incidents when the people involved are emotionally invested in being right. I decided against all of it, not because I was afraid of the confrontation. I have been in rooms with very large and very difficult men in high-stakes professional situations for 32 years, and I have never confused the willingness to hold your position with the usefulness of making noise about it. I decided against it because I have watched a certain kind of person spend enormous portions of their life in the management of other people's low opinions of them, and I have never once seen it end in anything that was worth what it cost. What I decided, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee, was this. I was going to continue being exactly who I was. I was going to do the work I was doing. I was going to let the world do what the world always eventually does, which is reveal itself. And I was going to wait, not with patience exactly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has been doing accurate work for long enough to know that accurate work tends to land eventually. Let me tell you about what I was doing in those 3 years, because it is the whole story. When I sold the firm, the sale agreement included a standard 18-month non-compete in the industrial infrastructure consulting space. When that period ended, I began accepting selective advisory work. Not because I needed income, because the phone was ringing with people I had worked alongside for decades who had projects that were interesting, and because I had discovered in the year after Margaret died that the worst thing a man of my disposition can do with his time is leave it unstructured. I did not have a website. I did not advertise. I did not update any professional profiles or send any announcements. I simply said yes to the calls that came from people whose judgment I trusted and whose work I thought I could actually help. Within the first year, I was doing advisory work for 3 different entities. A county government in Alabama on a water treatment expansion that their engineering team was getting wrong in ways that would have cost them considerably more than they anticipated. A private infrastructure investment group that was evaluating acquisition targets and needed someone who could look at an operational assessment and tell them whether what they were reading reflected reality. And a regional utilities authority in Tennessee whose board had questions about long-term infrastructure maintenance strategy that their internal team was not positioned to answer. In the second year, a former colleague named Frank Delacroix called me. Frank had spent 25 years in federal infrastructure policy before moving to the private sector, and in his last role before retirement, he had become involved with an organization called the American Infrastructure Futures Institute. AIFI was a nonpartisan research and policy organization focused on the long-term sustainability of American public infrastructure, water systems, transportation networks, municipal power grids, the kind of foundational civic engineering that tends to get discussed at a policy level by people who have never stood in a crawl space at 6 in the morning trying to understand why the pressure readings don't match the blueprints. Frank asked if I would be interested in serving on AIFI's senior advisory board. He said they were trying to build something that connected the policy conversation to the practical reality of how infrastructure actually worked in the field, and that they needed people who had done the field work at the level I had done it. I said yes. About a year after that, the executive director of AIFI, a woman named Dr. Carol Simons, called to ask if I would be willing to deliver the keynote address at their annual Infrastructure Leadership Conference. The conference was a significant event. 400 attendees, municipal officials, infrastructure executives, policy researchers, private capital groups interested in infrastructure investment. It was designed to be the kind of gathering where serious people had serious conversations that produced actual decisions, as opposed to the kind of conference that produces a PDF nobody reads. She said she wanted someone who could address the room not from a policy framework, but from the perspective of someone who had actually done the work. Someone who knew what it looked like from the ground, not the podium. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 5 days. I am not someone who speaks easily in large public formats. My entire professional life was spent in rooms where the work did the talking and the man behind it was largely invisible. That was a deliberate choice. I had watched men in my industry spend energy on their professional image that would have been better directed at the actual problems, and I had always thought the work was the right place to put the weight. The idea of a keynote address was foreign to the version of professional life I had built. But I also thought about what Margaret would have said. She would have said, "Walter, You have been talking to small rooms for 30 years because you decided large rooms weren't worth the preparation. She would have been right. She was usually right about the things I was avoiding. I called Dr. Simons back and said yes. I spent 8 weeks preparing the speech. I worked on it the way I work on any serious project, which is by going back to the original materials, the real work, the actual cases, and building the argument from the ground up, rather than from the conclusion backward. I rehearsed it in my kitchen and on my back porch, and once, sitting in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store, because there was a section in the middle about the gap between how infrastructure policy gets written and how infrastructure actually fails, and I needed to hear it at conversational speed to know whether the rhythm was right. The conference was being organized in partnership with a corporate events group. AIFI handled the content. The corporate partner handled the logistics, the venue, and the commercial sponsorships. 3 weeks before the event, I received the full event documentation from AIFI's office. I looked through it the way I look through any project brief, methodically, starting from the back. The primary commercial sponsor was a company called Meridian Group, a holding company with interests in commercial real estate, event management, and strategic partnerships. Below the Meridian Group entry on the sponsorship page was a list of affiliated organizational partners who had contributed to the event's production. One of them was Vantage Group, my daughter-in-law's employer. I read it twice. Then I put the document down and looked out the window at the yard for a while. I considered calling Dr. Simons to disclose the connection and ask whether it created any complication. I considered telling Daniel. I considered whether this was the kind of thing that required action or simply acknowledgement. I decided it required acknowledgement only. The speaking commitment was about the work. The work had nothing to do with Renata or Vantage Group or the 3 years of being introduced as Daniel's father in that specific tone. I was not going to withdraw from something I had committed to because my daughter-in-law's employer was listed in the sponsorship section. That would have been a different kind of cowardice than the kind I had already decided against. What I did not do was tell anyone. Not Daniel, not Frank, not Dr. Simons. I kept it to myself, the way I kept most things to myself, not out of strategy exactly, but out of the understanding that some information changes the shape of a situation in ways that are not useful to anyone. I bought a suit, a good charcoal suit, properly tailored by a man in Buckhead who had been dressing men for formal occasions since I was in my 30s, and who said, when he pinned the final alterations, that I looked like someone who was about to go somewhere important. I told him I thought that was probably accurate. He laughed in the way of a man who has heard a lot of sentences in a fitting room and knows when one is real. I got a haircut. I had my shoes resoled and polished. I did all the small things that Margaret would have done for me or reminded me to do, and I did them in the particular quiet of a house that has had someone in it for a long time and now holds only the memory of what that presence felt like. The conference was on a Thursday evening, the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel in downtown Atlanta. 12 tables of 10 in a room with the kind of ceiling that makes conversations feel consequential. The floral arrangements were the expensive kind that look effortless specifically because of how much effort was put into making them look that way. The string quartet near the entrance was playing something I recognized but could not immediately name, and I stood in the doorway for a moment before going in, the way I used to stand at the entrance of a new project site before the first walkthrough, just taking in the geometry of the space. Frank met me near the registration area and walked me through the evening. Dinner at 6:30, organizational remarks at 7:45, my introduction and keynote at 8:15. I would be introduced by AIFI's communications director, a man named Robert Pruitt, who I had met once at an advisory board meeting and who had the dry, economical manner of someone who understood that his job was to warm up the room and then get out of the way. Frank walked me to my assigned table, table 9. I sat down, introduced myself to the couple on my left, both in municipal finance from Tennessee. The man directly across from me was a water utility director from North Carolina named Stewart, who had strong opinions about infrastructure funding allocation and expressed them without being asked, which I found I did not mind at all. Easy people to be at a dinner with. Present, direct, doing the actual work. At 7:15, Renata arrived with 4 colleagues from Vantage Group. I watched them from across the room before they reached the table. She was in a dark navy dress, moving through the room the way she always moves through professional rooms, with the specific efficiency of someone who has already mapped every conversation worth having and is simply executing the map. She stopped twice to greet people she knew, both times with the precision of someone who never wastes a greeting. She reached table 9. She saw me. It lasted a fraction of a second, the thing that crossed her face. Professional composure is a real skill, and she had it. And the recovery was fast. But I have been reading rooms and the people in them for 32 years, and I saw it. The briefest interruption in the program. Then the warmth came back on, calibrated and correct. She said, "Walter, I didn't realize you would be here." I said, "It's a good event. I'm glad Frank invited me." She introduced me to her colleagues. I shook hands. Stewart from North Carolina made a comment about the bread rolls, which were very good, and we talked about that for a while. The conversation moved into infrastructure funding, as conversations at these events tend to do, and I contributed when I had something to contribute and listened the rest of the time. At no point did Renata ask me why I was there or in what capacity. I may have read in her assessment of me as a guest of a guest, an older man who had been brought along to a nice event by someone who worked in the industry. She did not ask. I did not explain. We ate dinner. It was a serious dinner, beef tenderloin, properly cooked, with a reduction that someone had spent real time on. The table conversation was warm and lateral, the kind that happens when competent people are seated together and are not trying to impress each other. And it was among the more pleasant dinners I had attended in the previous 3 years. At 7:45, the organizational remarks began. AIFI's Executive Director, Dr. Simons, spoke for 7 minutes about the state of American infrastructure with the directness of a person who has been working on a problem long enough to be genuinely tired of people not taking it seriously enough. The Deputy Director gave a brief remarks on AIFI's recent policy publications. 2 sponsor acknowledgments. Vantage Group was mentioned. Renata's table responded with the appropriate professional warmth. At 8:10, I excused myself from the table. Renata was in conversation with one of her colleagues about next quarter's event schedule. She did not look up when I pushed my chair back and folded my napkin and stood. I walked to the staging area. Robert Pruitt was there with 2 production staff. He shook my hand and asked if I was ready. I said yes. He said, "I'll keep it to 3 minutes. I know you got 8, and you're going to need all of it." I said that sounded right. He walked to the podium. He introduced AIFI. He spoke about the organization's 15 years of work connecting infrastructure policy to infrastructure practice. Then he said he was going to introduce the evening's keynote speaker. He said this was a man who had spent 32 years doing the actual work of American infrastructure, not analyzing it from a distance, but standing inside it, making the decisions that determined whether the systems functioned or didn't. He listed a few specifics: 14 states, 3 legislative testimonies, the firm I had built and sold. He said my name. The screen behind the podium lit up. A photograph, a professional headshot taken for the AIFI advisory board, me in a jacket, looking directly at the camera with what I hoped was a composed expression and what was probably slightly more complicated than that. My name in large, clean type. Senior Advisory Fellow, American Infrastructure Futures Institute. Below it, 4 lines of biography. The room applauded. Robert stepped back from the podium. I walked up the 3 stairs to the stage. I want to tell you what I saw when I turned to face the room, because this is the part I have thought about the most in the 3 weeks since it happened, and I want to be precise about what it was and what it was not. Table 9 was to my left. Renata was in the 4th seat from the left. She had been applauding with the room, the automatic professional applause that people produce at these events when a speaker is announced. And then the name registered, and the applause continued from the room, but her hand stopped, and she looked at the screen and the face on the screen, and then she turned to the empty seat beside her, and then she looked at the stage, and I was there. That is what I saw. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because there is a version of this story where I felt vindicated, where I stood at the podium and looked out at the room and thought, here it is. Here is the moment that answers everything. I want to tell you, that was not what it felt like. What it felt like was quieter than that. It felt like the particular relief of a long-running project finally arriving at the phase where the work becomes visible. Not vindication, not triumph over anyone, just the closing of a distance between what the work actually was and how it was being seen. The work did not become real in that moment. The work had been real for 32 years before Walter Greer had any opinion about it. What the moment was the first time I could see it from the outside with some distance, the way you sometimes cannot see what you have built until you are far enough away from it to see the whole shape. I gave the speech. I will not give you every word of it, because it was mine and it was specific, and it took 8 weeks to build. But I will tell you what I tried to do. I tried to close the distance between how infrastructure gets discussed in policy rooms and how it actually works in the field. I talked about the Hendricks County Water Treatment Project in 2008, where our assessment identified a design flaw 2 weeks before breaking ground that would have contaminated a residential aquifer and cost the county $6.2 million to remediate. I talked about the Morrison River Bridge reassessment in 2013, where our structural analysis contradicted the original engineering report, and a subsequent independent review confirmed our findings, and a bridge that was 3 months from opening was instead closed for 18 months of corrective reconstruction. I talked about what it feels like to be the person who is accountable for whether the numbers are right, knowing that the margin for error is not a quarterly earnings variance, but a municipal water supply or a load-bearing support structure. And I talked briefly about Margaret. I did not say her name. I said I lost someone who had been watching me do this work for 30 years, and when I thought about what the work had meant and whether the cost of it had been worth it, what I came back to every time was that the work was the truest version of me I knew how to produce. She knew that. She made room for it. She stood beside it long enough to see what it was trying to become. And if the work has meaning beyond the projects themselves, it is partly because someone believed in the work before the work had proven itself. I looked at the back wall of the room when I said that. I am telling you that plainly. I finished at 23 minutes. The room stood. Not all of it. I would say 3/4 of it. And I want to be honest about this too. A full standing ovation at an infrastructure policy dinner would have worried me. But the portion that stood did so with an energy I recognized, the specific energy of an audience that heard something they were not expecting and found that it landed somewhere real. Frank was on his feet, with his hands together, and his eyes doing the thing they do when a person who does not usually show emotion is showing emotion. Dr. Simons was smiling in the specific way of someone whose instinct about a decision turned out to be correct. Robert came back to the podium and closed the formal program with a graciousness that was brief and genuine. I shook Frank's hand. I thanked Dr. Simons. I stood for a few minutes with the North Carolina Water Utility Director Stewart, who had walked over to say that a section of the speech about federal funding cycles and local infrastructure maintenance budgets was the clearest he had ever heard it stated. And we talked for 10 minutes about a project in Charlotte that sounded like it had some of the same structural issues as the Hendricks County situation from 2008. Then I walked toward the bar and ordered a club soda. I had a choice at that moment about what to do next. I could return to Table 9. I could seek out Renata. I could allow the situation to exist in its current state with whatever she was processing still unprocessed and simply let the evening continue. I thought about all of these, standing at the bar with my club soda, watching the room in the way I watch rooms, taking in what was actually there. Renata found me. I give her that. She crossed the room deliberately, which required something, and she stood in front of me with the composure she always wore at professional events, though I could see it was costing more than usual. She said, "Walter." I had no idea. I said, "I know." She said, "Daniel never told me about any of this. The firm, the advisory work, the testimony, any of it." I said, "Daniel didn't know about the keynote. I hadn't told him." She was quiet for a moment. One of her younger Vantage Group colleagues was nearby, and Renata was aware of this, as she was always aware of spatial context in professional settings. She said, "I want to apologize to you." I said, "You don't need to do that right now." She said, "I think I do." I looked at her. I thought about Gail Trenton at that wedding reception telling me what she had been told. Sweet enough, but honestly, he is just a retired nobody. I thought about 3 years of dinner tables and introductions and the particular texture of being spoken about as though the person being spoken about is not in the room and would not understand the conversation even if they were. I thought about Daniel on my back porch with 2 glasses of bourbon. I thought about Charlie on the tire swing, wanting to go higher every single time. I thought about Margaret. I said, "Renata, I'm going to say something, and I want to say it once, clearly, and then I'm not going to come back to it, not at Christmas, not when we disagree about something else, not as leverage at some future point where it would be useful to me. Do you understand?" She said, "Yes." I said, "What you have said about me in professional settings has been wrong. Not wrong because I turned out to be someone with impressive credentials. Wrong because a man does not need to have impressive credentials to deserve to be spoken of with basic respect by his son's wife. I spent 32 years building something real. I am glad you know what it is now. But knowing what it is now is not what the apology should be for. The apology should be for the thing that was true regardless of whether you ever knew what I had built. Do you understand the difference?" She was quiet. Then she said, "Yes." Flat, without performance, without the upward inflection that makes an acknowledgement into a transaction. She said, "I'm sorry, Walter." I said, "I know." She stood there for another moment. Then she said, "Daniel is lucky to have you." I did not say anything to that. Not because it wasn't a real thing to say, but because there was a young Vantage Group employee standing 8 feet away, and Renata had just said something that cost her in front of a witness. And I thought the most dignified response was to let it land without covering it up with words. She went back to her table. I finished my club soda. Frank came and found me, and we talked for 25 minutes about a proposed infrastructure investment conference in Phoenix that AIFI was considering for the following year, and whether there was a program structure that would make it more useful than the last one. We shook hands, and he said, "Walter, I have wanted to put you in front of a room like that for 3 years. I told him I was glad he had eventually been persuasive about it. He laughed in the way of a man who knows the persuasion was mostly just waiting. I drove home at 11:30. My house was quiet in the specific way it has been quiet since Margaret. Not empty, not lonely exactly, just the particular acoustic of a space that once held more and has not quite adjusted to holding less. I made tea. I sat on the back porch. The temperature was in the low 50s, cold enough for a jacket, and I went inside and got one and came back out and sat with my tea and looked at the yard. I thought about Margaret. I thought about what she would have said if she had been watching the evening from wherever she watches things from. If she watches things. I know what she would have said. She would have said, "Walter, you have always done your best work when you were not doing it for anyone but yourself." She would have said it the way she said most things, with the dry warmth of a woman who had been paying very close attention for 30 years and was not going to pretend she hadn't. And she would have been smiling when she said it. That specific smile, the one that meant she thought she was right and was pretty sure I agreed with her, and we were both going to take a moment to appreciate the clarity. I miss that smile. I will miss it every single day until I don't have days left to miss it on. Daniel called the next morning at 8:15. Renata had told him when she got home. He said, "Dad," just my name, twice, the same way he said it on the back porch with the bourbon. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I told him the same thing I had told Renata. Because if I had told you, you would have told her. And if she had known, the evening would have been about managing that instead of just about the work. He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "Are you angry at her?" I thought about the question the way I think about questions that deserve a real answer rather than a reflexive one. I said no. He said, "Really?" I said, "Daniel, your wife is very good at her work, and she drew the wrong conclusion about who I was, and now she has more information, and she can draw a different one. That is generally how things get corrected. I am not interested in being angry about a problem that has already resolved itself." He was quiet again. He said, "I should have told her more about you. I just assumed she would ask. I didn't think about the fact that she was making her assessment on what she could see, and what she could see was just a guy at the dinner table who didn't talk about himself. I said, 'You are not responsible for what she decided.' He said, 'I know, but I'm responsible for not filling in the picture.' That's different, and I'm sorry for that. I thought about that. I told him I appreciated it. I meant it. He said, 'Charlie wants to know if you're coming Saturday.' I said, 'For the tire swing?' He said, 'He specifically said he wants you to push him until your arms fall off.' His words. I said I would be there. He said, 'I love you, Dad.' I said, 'I love you too.' We hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a while with my second cup of coffee. Outside the window, the morning was doing what October mornings do in Atlanta, the light coming in at the angle that makes ordinary things look considered, like someone arranged them. Margaret always said October light was the only light that didn't try too hard. I never found a reason to disagree with that. I pushed Charlie on the tire swing for 50 minutes on Saturday. He wanted to go higher every time, with the absolute conviction of a 4-year-old who has not yet encountered a ceiling on what is available if you ask loudly enough. I pushed him until my shoulders ached, and then I pushed him some more, because the sound he made when he was up high and moving fast was a sound I wanted to keep making happen for as long as my body allowed it. He was laughing the way children laugh when they are entirely uncomplicatedly happy, with their whole bodies, with no part of them uncertain about whether the happiness is the right amount. I laughed too. I want to tell you what the gala changed and what it did not change. It did not change the work. The work was what it was for 32 years before Renata knew about it. The water treatment projects were real, whether she knew about them or not. The bridge assessments were real. The firm was real. The testimony was real. None of that needed her to know about it to be true. I understood this clearly, and I want to make sure it is clear here. The work did not become real when it was seen. It was always real. The seeing was not the point. What the gala changed was smaller and more personal than that. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being chronically seen incorrectly by someone in your immediate life. Not a dramatic exhaustion. Not the kind that produces confrontations or ultimatums or the kind of conversations where people say things they cannot take back. The quiet kind, the accumulating kind, the kind that settles into the way you carry yourself in certain rooms, the slight adjustment you make to how much of yourself you bring to a space because you have understood that most of it will not be received. That is the exhaustion I had been living with for 3 years. And when I walked off that stage and stood at the bar with my club soda and watched the room and thought about Margaret and thought about the work, I felt it lift. Not because Renata now knew what I had done, but because the distance between what the work was and how it was being seen had, even briefly, even in one room, collapsed to nothing. That is what changed. That was enough. In my experience, that is always enough. I am going to tell you one more thing, and then I am done. On the drive home from Daniel's house on Saturday, with my shoulders aching from 50 minutes on the tire swing and the windows down because the October air in Atlanta at 4 in the afternoon is still one of the better things the world produces, I thought about the version of me that had signed a $340,000 consulting contract for a water treatment project in Alabama in 2003 with 2 employees and a rented truck and no certainty that any of it would work. I thought about the version of me that had sat at Renata's dinner table for 3 years and talked about books and weather and Charlie's new words and had not explained a single thing about what I was. I thought about the version of me that had stood at a podium in front of 400 people and said out loud, briefly and without drama, that the person I had loved most in my life had stood beside the work long enough to see what it was trying to become. I thought about all 3 of those men, and I thought about how they were the same man at different distances from himself, and I thought that the work had always been the thread connecting them, the one constant that had not changed shape or quality or direction regardless of what anyone in any room had thought about it. Then I thought about Charlie on the tire swing, his face when he was at the top of the arc, looking out at the yard and the trees in the distance with the expression of a child who has just discovered that going high is a real option and is deciding it should be the default. I thought about Margaret. I thought she would have loved this exactly. If you have ever sat at a table where someone had already decided what you were worth and kept doing the work anyway, not for them, not to prove them wrong, but because the work was what was true and the work was where you lived, share this. Someone watching this right now is carrying the same quiet exhaustion. They need to hear that the distance closes eventually, not always in a dramatic room, not always in front of 400 people, but the work has a way of introducing itself in the end. It always does. See you in the next one.